Hi, I'm Dennis, and I'm a UX UI designer. Have been for about 20 years now. But I'm also leading the team at Creative Navy, where we create user interfaces for highly complex applications, be they anything that is medtech, medical devices, medical software, or also software used to simulate explosions or to make satellites go onto orbit. It's all stuff that I enjoy doing, and it's difficult stuff sometimes. But the great thing is that helps me learn a lot, and so I'm glad to be here to share a little bit of that.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Dennis. For the product community, it's great to have you, a huge expert in UX UI design. Our industry needs people like you. We need to improve in that regard. We have probably a lot of people here that know what is UX UI. As you mentioned, you have been the mastermind behind the Creative Navy for many years now. But could you tell us a bit more? What is UX UI and why does it matter in our healthcare world?
Well, look, UX and UI is about as valuable and as dangerous as an oil rig, right? Because the thing is, what it does is it really helps you extract the value from technology. Technology is absolutely amazing, but unless you have people interacting with it to do some useful stuff, it just sits there and it does nothing. So, because of that, I say it is like an oil rig because you can extract the value out of that. And I'll give you an example. For example, quite a while ago, we created the interface for a radiation therapy device where the thing or the added value that UX brought was, amongst other things, that you could actually go through the workflow so efficiently that you could do another patient per day. So, it reaches a certain threshold where it becomes a new thing. Another patient per day means 300 more patients or 300 more sessions per year. That is a big thing. That is really the value of UX UI design. But it is also a dangerous thing, just like an oil rig, because if you do it wrong, it has the exact opposite effect. And for example, in this medical world, a great example of that is medical records, right? They were brought in as a huge innovation. It's going to change everything. The world will become an utopia because of that. Well, we've had them for a while now, and there's a lot of scientific research, academic research that shows that actually what they do is they mainly drive up burnout for doctors. And so now we're wondering, why don't we have enough doctors? Well, we never had enough doctors, but now we have even fewer because they get burned out and because it's not an attractive profession anymore. So here we see how the element of the interface that we offer for people to interact with technology can become a blessing or a curse. And UX UI design, I would say, is anything that makes that, that tries to affect that for better or for worse. I would go with this very broad definition rather than just saying it's people designing buttons on a screen. Because, yes, if you have buttons on a screen, then that is part of UX UI design. But the core thing that it does is actually it opens up this interface for people to extract value from technology.
Amazing. And I like the example. We are in healthcare, health tech, now really starting to introduce all the concept of UX UI. You just mentioned that you could burn out people if you don't do it properly. We are lacking behind still, I think, from my perspective. Do you have an idea why?
Look, I will be a little bit brutal here, and I will pull out the carpet, underneath this idea of medtech, the challenges of medtech, and why is medtech difficult. Yes, there are some things about medtech that make it different from other fields. No, there's a huge responsibility. Product life cycles are longer. Maybe investments because of that are bigger. You cannot make changes that easily. There's regulation, all of that. Yes, that makes medtech difficult. It, there are other industries where it's just as difficult or even more. So I wouldn't use that as an excuse. If you really want to analyze things, you would have to look at those factors. But the key thing I think that we can affect is and look at is the element of culture. I think medtech is lagging behind because people find comfort in lagging behind because they feel protected that, when something is painful, we have no choice but to use our devices. And there aren't really that many because we have a lot of barriers set up for smaller companies to come in. Great stuff. Same thing that banks said. And then in a span of maybe 1 or 2 years, you had a lot of challenger banks come in, and now all the established banks look at where are our customers. We had millions, and now we have, where are they? Well, they are there with the people who dare to do things differently. And that's the thing that I think is missing in medtech, this openness to do things differently. You can do them differently in a safe manner, But as long as you insist on the status quo and don't want to change your ways because you think you know better because you're, I don't know, you have something that makes you better, at the end of the day, you're going to lose. And that's what I think what we see in medtech today.
Right, and I like the example with the bank. I was just thinking, I had a discussion with a friend working in a bank and one working in a neobank in France. And the one working in the traditional banks just keep saying that you guys are just not bank, you are not serious, you are not whatever. However, the neobank is taking all of their customer. It's just like we just make it easy for people. We are not better, we just make it easy. You guys have so much burden,
Yes.
or sometimes we just get cost. I don't know. One of the things they did is to not charge premium, on top of your change fee when you work in multiple currency. So they're like, we just charge a rate that we do interbank. We don't need to put a premium on top of that. And just with this couple of change, making easy with an app and that, they were having really simple interface and they managed to get a lot of customers from the classic bank. So, and kudos to Conto. My friend is working as a developer for
Yeah.
Conto and they are the one making it easy. And
Yeah, and you
I
know
think,
what's happening? Sorry to interrupt. Well, I was just going to say, you know what's happening with the banks is, so they came in with this revolution. Customers followed. They said, "Oh, great! Finally, someone who does it better." And then the bank said, "Yeah, but you're not us. You're not a real bank." And so the challenger bank said, "Okay, great. We don't even want to be, but we will do the thing that works. That's the thing we'll focus on, not on being something, but on doing something." So they grew. And what you now have is you have the challenger banks becoming established as banks. And guess what? Now they're banks. The argument of you're not a bank, it doesn't mean anything anymore. No, we are a bank. We're a bank bigger than you.
mhm. No, that's true, and that's very funny. For a long time, the battle on the formality, saying people, oh, if you're not claiming you're a bank, people will never move to you. And actually, they did. And then they just did the work
Yeah.
to become an official bank and to not have anybody as a backup. Or some even smarter banks started to partner with those neobank. So they get the best outcome, and they don't even have to put the work behind on the chain of culture, etc. That's a
Yeah.
very good example. And I think that's also the banking industry is very similar to us because we have in the banking industry a lot of regulation. And again, also in our industry, regulatory is often used as a way to say, oh, we can do that for regulatory reason, or we can do that for whatever legal reason. And I think it's also something that makes us lagging behind, maintaining this as status quo, even though when you have a smart regulatory person with you, or when you have a smart legal team, they find a way to make things better, challenge the status quo, and still being compliant. And I think that's the main difference.
I agree.
That's them.
The
So,
thing with regulation is people see it as sort of an antagonist. It's as if it tells you, don't do good UX. You have to do UX in a particular way. But that's not true. If you look it in the eye, regulation doesn't tell you the way it has to look. It just tells you you have to abide by a process in which you have to pay attention to certain things. Now, if you can't deal with that, there are two possibilities. Either you're a shallow designer or you're a shallow compliance manager. What I mean by that is that as a designer, the one thing you can do is you say, I can retreat from this and I will just do whatever the compliance manager says because I give up. I will not try to come up with new ideas because the first ones I had were shut down. That makes you a shallow designer. You should go out there and try to understand the regulation and the requirements, get out of your shell as a designer, and then you will be able to come up with ideas that can pass compliance. The same way as a compliance manager, if you keep shooting down things just because they're not the same thing you've seen before, without actually trying to think about, okay, did we follow the right process? Can we get this through regulation and so on? Because you can, if you abide by the right process, right? That's the thing. Regulation doesn't tell you to come up with bad UX or stick with the UX that we've already had. It just tells you when you come up with something new, do it in a way that is safe and sound. And I think that's a great idea. We just have to work a little bit harder.
and that's, I think, this effort of doing things a little bit harder that make us paying on the status quo. At the end of the day, you have many approaches that you can use, as you mentioned, but I think it requires something. And this thing is try to go a bit beyond what is your job description, which is saying like, oh, I only need to do compliance. Yes, you have to do compliance as a compliance manager or as a VNV tester, but on top of that, can I step a bit in the shoe of the designer? And that make a huge difference from my perspective. And the same for the person that is working as UX designer. If he can step a bit into the shoe of the regulatory manager or the shoe of the compliance manager, then it helps to understand what are the problems, what are the problematic of each other, and after that you can have amazing outcome. And I think this is also coming a bit from that magic of doing things a bit beyond your responsibility, taking ownership to make things better and not give up. And this is how you, at the end of the day, end up with amazing design. What do you think about that?
I completely agree. I think that is very necessary. And I think if you follow that thought more, I think you get into an area which is at first a little bit scary, but if you get used to that emotion, I think I at least find a lot of depth within it. What I mean is, right, we're in the medical field and you think of things being done in a particular way, but there are other ways to do things. I'm thinking, for example, of inventors or researchers in the past who take huge risks. Like, I don't remember who the discoverer was who discovered the Helicobacter bacteria. He experimented on himself, you know, taking a huge risk, knowing that he's taking a huge risk, possibly causing his death. And I'm sure he's done it in a very lucid way because he asked himself the question, what am I doing here? Am I trying to help others to solve this? If yes, then maybe this self sacrifice isn't that much of a big deal. If I'm in it for the money, then yes, it's stupid. You wouldn't want to die for the money. But if it's for something else, then maybe it's worth it. It's because of these people or people like this, or who've taken risks that maybe weren't that big, but still significant for their own life in terms of the comfort that they were enjoying. It's because of people like that that we now have the comfort of, doing a podcast talking about what if I work a little bit harder and I don't know what I sacrifice for that, but it's definitely not my life. It's not even a big thing. That's where I think that the thing that sits underneath this idea of stepping outside my role is stepping outside my comfort zone. And so the question is for what? Well, I have to answer that. Maybe for doing good.
Mhm. Definitely. But I also think one of the reasons sometimes things are a bit behind and people don't go out of their comfort. In product team, I see that UX is a bit of the latecomer in the party. We have been, at least in healthcare, in the industry with some developers for a while, product management, or at least someone doing project management has been there for since forever to try to steer project, make things working. And later we have brought a UX UI designer saying, hey, to make things a bit more useful for the customers, for the patient, for the doctors, we need you, but it's still seen as a support function. Personally, I don't really like this idea of support function in the product team of UX. From your perspective, what should be the function and how should interact the UX designer with the team?
I think it's really interesting what you bring up, this idea of sort of when did UX come up in the process and what were all the other key players who were already at the table when it came up. It's interesting that actually the idea of user experience in a very sort of deliberate way comes from the medical world, where we have human factors, where the point was let's do something that doesn't cause harm. But it was this perspective of let's design it just enough so people don't die while using it, which is, imagine that, putting that on a website. The UX is barely enough for you not to die while using it. It doesn't cut it anymore today, does it? It would be honest. But then, we had all the rest happening. And I think eventually UX came back to the table as a little thing. But in the meantime, what has happened is that, in the beginning, in every industry, it is in a way easy to add value and to come up with valuable products because all the low hanging fruit are still there. Once you reaped a lot of them, you start to have, I don't know, CEOs, shareholders, lots of other functions come and say, guys, we need more value. We need value so we can sell it, transform it into cash. And you keep mining everything you can. And then eventually someone really desperate says, well, we are running out of value, guys. Where is the value? It has to come from somewhere. Let's find it. We're desperate. I think what happens is that because things are becoming very specialized, I'm the developer. I don't bring value. I program. I'm the project manager. I make sure that we have everything organized, but I don't know where the value comes from. Marketing says, well, I sell you the product that you've made to be valuable. If you haven't made it to be valuable, then I cannot sell. Nobody's taking responsibility for that. I think UX is in a unique position to take responsibility for that. And it's a scary thing to take responsibility for that. But the reason why UX is in a position to do that is because user experience or the idea of an interface is precisely that place where users with their needs, as elusive as they are, they come together with the technology, they come together with the operations, with how you can actually produce a device or whatever it is, and they come together with the element of business strategy. So somehow all of this stuff ends up on the table of a designer, a user interface designer, if they have the openness to face that. Because as I said, it's a scary thing. But I think if you do that, the job becomes a lot more interesting. You help your team. And I think the people in the team then also open up. Because once you show that you can deliver a little bit of that, people will say, you know what, let's listen to this designer because it's interesting what they say.
Definitely. And I see that with some of the UX designer that I brought in some teams that didn't have UX designer before, you have to show the value. Because a
Mhm.
developer, the first reaction I remember when I tried to bring some UX designer in a team was, why do you want us to have now a UX designer? We do design and we have a software since years. It's working. People love it. Do you mean we do bad job since all this time? This has nothing to do with that. It's just that it's becoming more and more complex. We are bringing much more things together. Also, the competition is tougher. Now, reaching your clinical outcome is not enough. And that's what I try to explain a lot to people when I discuss with them. Great,
Mhm.
your software can do the function you ask him to do. That's a fact. I don't want to challenge that. But what's the pain to go through the process? And I remember one story I had one day. They were telling me about a competitor. They're like, that's the best competitor of the market because he had all the features. You know,
Mhm.
when they do all those features competition, sometimes in corporate to try to check, oh, is this the best software? Do we have that feature? And I said, try to listen to me. Have a look at the software and what I can organize for you. I will bring a couple of company, couple of software, and I will ask you to do the workflow from A to Z. Let's rediscuss after that
Mhm.
what is the best software. And it was back in the day, it was a bit mental, the approach that I took. And they told me that it needs to have more features. That's the only question we have. And even in product management, showing them that having more feature is not meaning having more value. And you mentioned we need the value needs
Mhm.
to come from somewhere. And I think in our days, the value comes a lot from the user interface, your interoperability with other product, which is user experience at the end of the day. How your software or your hardware is integrated in the environment of the customer is very important. It's not because it works perfectly well in your lab that you have a successful software. If you realize that at the end of the day, this is the nurse or not the doctor using the software, and the nurse is not skilled enough to understand whatever, then all your development is useless. All the clinical benefits you want to bring to the table will never reach the patient. So,
Yeah.
you know, and I have this sentence that is a bit creating a bit of controversy. It's clinical outcome is just not enough. And
I
same
really
with the
love the
software.
example. Yeah. It's a great example because it's so typical of people to think when it comes to value, to think in terms of features, abundance of features. And, I understand that because it's typical for us, especially, let's say, older generations. I think there's also a generational thing to this. But the idea that value is intrinsic in something, right? Like, I don't know, I have a car. The value is in the car, and when I drive around, it follows me everywhere. And when I sell the car, the value is inside the car and it takes off with the car, which is a very old school way of thinking. But I think it's sort of intuitive to us humans because we are used to objects. The thing is actually that the value of a car is not in the car. You can resell it, right? But it's for a fraction of the value. The value is actually that you can get from A to B. Um, it's the service that it gives you. That is why the experience you have in the car, where maybe you have air conditioning and you don't have to sweat while you do it, or that, I don't know, it does certain things that would make it easier for you to drive and so on. That is the value, because the car is actually just a platform for a service, and the service is something that happens every time you use it. There's actually a technical term for it. It's called value in use. The same thing is with in healthcare, especially, right? It's not, you have a very expensive piece of machinery. Well, great. If it just sits there, nobody uses it, then it's worth exactly nothing. If you use it, then it gives you the value of a human life or the value of health and so on. And so people think of value in this terms of number of features, but they don't think about what people go through while they're actually trying to extract this value from the technology, which they always do through the user interface. This reminds me of a great example where we had a customer once. They had a clinical management system, so lots around scheduling, medical records, all of that, especially used by private clinics. And they had been around for a very long time, now trying to expand into other markets where there was more competition. And so, potential prospects told them, yeah, I don't know, I don't really like it. And so they came to us and said, let's make the interface prettier. It's not pretty enough. We need more colors and more icons and so on. So we said, well, would be a strange thing if you could somehow bring in more value just through some icons or improving the colors. That's unfortunately not how design works. But before even we as designers, we are the design gods, will tell you what's wrong. Before we adopt this attitude, let's look at what the users do. Let's research that. When was the last time that you watched a user interact with actually use the thing? And they say, well, we've never done that. The users that we already have love us. So we said, really? Well, let's do a thing. Let's make a bet. We go out there, watch how they use it. If it turns out that they absolutely love it and there's nothing they want to change, it's for free. If you find anything that's valuable, it's not for free. And I cannot tell you the sort of stuff we discovered. For most receptionists or people who were actually using it, it was a huge pain and horrible. It took longer engaging with that piece of technology than actually doing the rest of their job, right? They had a scheduling system. They had clinics that had a special board on the wall, a special part of the wall dedicated to post-its where they would post the appointments because they couldn't get them fast enough into the system. And then at the end of the day, they would spend another half an hour on top of the usual job to enter that in. So complete catastrophe. The reason for that was that they had never really spent the time to think about what do these people actually need? What is the experience of a receptionist when they have to enter an appointment, someone's on the phone, someone's coming in, 3 things happening at the same time, they wouldn't be able to do that with the software they had. So these insights, while very scary at first for them, they were really the basis for them to reconsider everything and improve it in a way where then people really said, well, it's amazing. Now we're going to recommend you. You will grow just by recommendations. You don't even have to do marketing anymore. But it's the power of actually considering what people want to do with your stuff.
And I find it crazy. I hear so many times such a story where the people that build the product or the company don't talk to their user. And the second thing is that they often don't see the user in the context of using the product. Because I think this is two things. One thing is talking to the user. And when I say the user, not the buyer, not the one that is fancy. Because I see a lot of, a lot of company, we spend a lot of time talking to, those key opinion leader, those very high-end doctors that have a staff with 100 people to deal with everything. And then based on their recommendation, you launch a product and then you realize you never get traction in the market. Because the reality is that nobody is having the staff of those big guys. In the real life, you cannot afford to have, 10% to fix all the broken part of the process that they describe to you. And those people, sometimes they don't even know that it is broken because they have 10 people fixing that for them without telling anything because they are the big boss and they want to look good. So the reality is going on site.
Yeah.
Observing is very important sometimes. Don't bring your biased question. Observe what they do and look at the reality. And with that, I would really love to understand, how do you, in the case of the scheduling system you mentioned, how do you do the discovery process?
Well, I think, the key thing with the discovery process is to find a sound balance between structure and, let's say, freedom or the lack of a structure. Because you need a structure for many reasons. On the one hand, you want to make it efficient. You want to actually try to understand things, so you have to be purposeful in the things that you do, but also you want to allow sufficient room for exploration to discover those things that you cannot anticipate. I think that actually the strongest thing that the discovery process can give you is those things that you cannot even anticipate. That's why I really loved the example you gave with observing, because when you ask, you get responses to your question. Might be better or worse, but they are responses to your question. If you don't even pose a question, you might notice the things that you didn't even think of. And of course, there are lots of methods. So I think an important thing about discovery is really to do it just as iteratively as you do the rest of the design. So rather than just frame your program and then execute it, think of a program, execute a little bit, rethink the program, execute more, and so on. I think that's the most important principle I would use. Of course, the method that you then use, or the many different methods that you use, and the way you deploy them, they make a huge difference. The way you ask a question, when you ask a question, is it a structured, unstructured interview, the preparation you do. So there's a lot that goes into that. It's not really simple. But I think what a lot of people do is when they go from I don't know what I should be doing to I will be doing this and that, and I will now excel at the method, they oftentimes lose this element of freedom and of discovery is a discovery. It's not, illuminating the things that you already know. It's discovery.
What we have as well, this framework that I really like. I don't remember the name exactly, but when you do discovery, this is a 2x2 matrix where say there is a level of knowledge and not knowledge. These things that I know that I already know, so we don't need to do really discovery there. Then you have some hypothesis, you have some idea of what you think you know, but you need to research. And then there is one big part, which is just what you don't know that you don't know. And that part of the discovery process is not to be forgotten. This is a huge part that when we start a discovery, we just don't even know. So that's why I like observing so much. I like to go there to understand how it's working in their particular situation, because I discover so many things I don't know. And sometimes I just realize that a lot of things that we bring into the clinic is having a huge benefit, yes, but it also creates so much burden. And this burden, even though we try to do research, we did the process as good as we could not anticipate, because always, So having this curiosity to go before you start the product, after you launch the product, try to see the impact you have on them, and really being hands-on is making for me a huge difference. And then I also realize that a lot of customers are very happy to open their doors to let's just observe. And I think it's really crazy how many teams just don't go visit their customers. And if you do that, your life gonna be just so much easier. Really.
Yeah. I think this is again a thing where medtech could benefit a little bit from what happens in all the rest of the world. Because there, right, the idea of an MVP, of a minimum viable product, has become so strong. It's a buzzword. Everybody does that. And let's let it be a buzzword for a while. I think that's okay. Because the underlying idea there is that, no matter how brilliant the thing that you create, once it actually meets reality, not simulated reality, but the real one, it becomes a platform to learn a lot of new things. It could be learning a lot of new things to improve the product a lot, because sooner or later it has to become improvable, right? Nothing is forever. But it could be that you actually learn a lot of other things that you didn't even anticipate. That's where I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to come up with new stuff where you bring out the product, you get a user base, whatever that is. And then instead of just thinking about your product, think about all the other problems that you could be solving for these people, including problems that you might have created unintentionally. But it's okay to face those and say, you know what, sorry for that. We didn't know, we really tried, but we now created also a series of problems. But the next best thing that we can do is try to solve them or mitigate them. It's at least 5,000 times better than denying them or hiding from them.
No, that's true. And sometimes it's also important to even take ownership on problem you create that are not really belonging to your product or your work per se. Sometimes you create some issue that are not necessarily product related, but it can be, I don't know, it could be due to the IT of your company, on the way you process order, or the way you invoice your customers. And what I really like to say to my colleagues that move to the digital world for product is that you need to stop having this narrow mindset. So, oh, okay, we are developing a pill from a big pharma, or we are developing an implant in a medtech company, which is the only thing that matters for me in my product. Now you also need to take care of the overall integration and everything from A to Z. Your product start when the customer order it, and it end up when you throw it away, basically. So it's much a
Yes.
longer span of topics that you have to deal with. And if you want to be successful, you have to own them end to end. Even if sometimes you have to go beyond your comfort zone. It's much bigger than just what you add in your job title, the little piece of software or the little piece of product you were thinking initially. And I
Yes.
think it's really about going beyond a traditional role. And that's the way I see product management. Product management is very close to UX. How do you see the interaction between our two worlds somehow?
I think there's ideally when it goes right, I think there's a lot of interaction, and it's really that, as you said, stepping outside of the comfort zone, stepping outside of your role, of the a narrow way to see your role, making that a little bit larger. I think that's where the magic happens. Because if you have a designer who says, you know what, I will make a few steps into the world of a product manager. If you have a product manager who says, I will make a few steps into the world of design, at least so much that I can understand the other party, things work really well. Because then what you have is you have 2 or 3 or 4 great minds who work together to piece something together that works. Because that's the thing with this process of, I think, developing any kind of product. You have to have a certain humility in the sense of saying that, you know what, we're trying to do something, but we don't really know whether we're succeeding. I think having that attitude rather than we know how to do things, we're doing them this way, this is going to be working, and we've done it right many times, we're doing it at the same time. No, it's just a little bit, you know what, we're trying to do it, let's see if it works. I think if you adopt this kind of attitude, you suddenly see the others as really people you can cooperate with and where you have to work together. And then what happens is that as a designer, you share a lot of the stuff that's, let's say, hidden behind the designs, a lot of the thinking that goes in there, a lot of the doubt that goes in there, a lot of the, I don't know how to solve this, and I don't know how to solve the fact that I don't know how to solve this. The same way, if you have a product manager who says, well, I'm not going to say it's your job as a designer to solve it. I will go away now, and when I come back, it better be solved. But rather saying, okay, let's look at this together. I also don't know how to solve it, and I don't know how to solve the fact that I cannot solve it. But let's try to do it together and see what comes out of that. I think these are some premises that help people step out of the role. And I think the conversations and the real working together that comes out of that, which is always very specific to the problem that you're trying to deal with. But if you deal with it from this position, then you will eventually come to a solution. And I think you will always find that the solution came out of working together with a product manager, with the developers, with different stakeholders, and so on. But I think for a lot of people, that is very scary also because I think they feel there's sort of a void in them. There's sort of this imposter syndrome where what if I'm not a good professional? What if I cannot deliver this? That makes me scared of the other stakeholders. And I think that's where they hold back and they say, well, my design part is excellent. The stuff that you have done isn't. And then the product manager says, no, the requirements were excellent, but the design isn't excellent. How do we move out of that? We've had, and we keep having countless projects with companies that have design teams that are larger than us. They have everything that they think they need, but still they are in this position where they say, designers say they've done everything, product managers say they've done everything, but the result isn't there. And then they say, please help us get out of this situation.
That's so true. And it is really about going a bit beyond your responsibility and just in the shoes, as I mentioned a bit earlier, of your designer, your developer. And if you have in your product team everybody doing that, your tech lead trying to understand design, your product manager trying to bring a bit more of his business context also as well. If you have the designer trying to understand a bit more the tech constraint that we have, but also the business aspect of the topic, that's where the magic can happen. But for that, my feeling is that you need to understand that it's not about doing your job. It's about taking ownership about the outcome you are going to create for the customers, for the patient, for the company. And this is where things start to be a bit complex. People like to say, oh, I done that task, done in the checklist. Yes, maybe, but it did not create any impact. Let's have a little iteration. Why in testing right after you did the design, everybody was lost. Then for me, as long as we don't have any impact, it's not done. And what I also see is you need to have the buy-in from your leadership for this kind of approach to be a bit more outcome driven. I had so many colleagues, or even myself, when you start to get pressured to deliver, and often they want you to deliver something. They didn't ask you to deliver something great. They want you to deliver something. So, like that, in this feature list that we were seeing at the beginning, oh, we have it now. Yes, nobody use it, but we have it. The sales team can, make some marketing team will make a nice collateral. The sales team will also brag about it to the customer. The customer eventually buy it, and then they never use it and they don't like us anymore. But that's the reality. When you start owning the outcome, and where your leadership agree to give you the time to do this one more iteration, maybe not 100 more iteration, but this one or two more iteration, because you know you are not there yet. You save so much time because you don't have to restart the full cycle. And that's where things start to be very different. And also when management starts to measure the outcome that you define at the beginning of the project with the team, then also the mindset change, because all of a sudden we don't try to have this new feature launch. All of a sudden we know that we need to have, I don't know, 80% of customers having positive review on the product, or whatever, outcome you want to reach. We want to have 10,000 daily users. It could be everything, but when you start to measure that instead of measuring, did we launch the project on time? I think this is where you start to be successful with the design, with the tech, with the management, with your product manager.
I really love this example that you gave. There is an expression in the English language which says passing on the buck. So basically, what you described, where everybody ticks off their to dos, but the responsibility just gets passed on. Someone else should take responsibility for whatever is outside of my bubble. And that then keeps happening. And I think we see a lot of that. There's actually a great rant that one of my colleagues published on LinkedIn. Really, in the world of rants, it's one of my favorites. We should link it when you publish that. But that is a huge problem, this element of passing on the buck. And I think that's also something that a lot of people, including product managers, don't really understand about design or about the role of a designer, which is that when you keep on passing on the buck and responsibility, then all of that ends up on the table of a designer. The designer doesn't really have that many places to hide and to go. So all of the contradictions, all of the unresolved things and so on, they are piled up on the designer. And then they suddenly have a brief that is completely contradictory and impossible to deliver on. And then you have different approaches to that. I think most designers, if that keeps on happening for a while and they see that nobody's listening, they either leave the company or they just say, you know what, I go to work, I move pixels around. It means absolutely nothing to me. I am dead inside while I'm at work. Afterwards, I don't know, I go home and I don't know, I drink or I spend time with my family, whatever it is as a coping mechanism. But I have completely given up. That's one possibility. And it's a real thing. I think a lot of companies pressure their designers and they say, we want you to do things, but the designer is dead. There is no more designer. This is not a designer anymore because you've killed the designer. Maybe the designer you hired was already dead when they came. The other thing that you can do as a designer is say, you know what, it's an impossible situation for me, but I won't give up. But I also realize that the solution is not in my screen. The solution is not in Figma. I have to do something with these stakeholders. And hopefully that, I think, could be the thing that makes you step out of the role and say, I have these stakeholders and they're very skeptical and negative, but I have to change the stakeholders now, which is very difficult changing a person, but it's the only solution. And if I truly care about my time on earth and this outcome, as you said, the actual outcome in reality, the final outcome, not my to-do list, then I have no choice. I have to do that. It's a tragic situation. A lot of people are in tragic situations that are much more uncomfortable than that.
That's true, but that's not the easy part. Influencing skills is very important. And do you have any good example or tips for people that are listening to us to be able to influence with design?
Yeah, well, there are lots of little things I think that hopefully accumulate. One important thing is to not consider the others to be stupid, because that is something you can retreat into. Say they are just stupid, they just don't get it. I'm not a genius, but I'm smarter, but they just don't get it. Um, when you feel yourself going to that direction, I think it's good to take a step back and say, whatever label I put on them, let's understand. Until I understand them and until I can feel the thing that they feel when they don't do what I think to be their job and so on, let's first understand it. I think once you understand it, your perspective will change. You might still think that they're not living up to a particular standard of profession or whatever it is, but at least you will understand, so you will see how you can influence things. Some things that I think are critical, three things that are critical are, first of all, demonstrating goodwill as a designer. I think a lot of designers, especially when they're early in their career, they feel very defensive, and that defensiveness comes across at the other end of the table as something like rigidity or closed-mindedness or something like that. And then the other person thinks, well, you're not trying. And the other designer, you say you're trying, that's what you do, but by the way you try, you create the impression that you don't. So that's why being conscious of demonstrating goodwill. For example, when they say do this thing and you're thinking, well, it's impossible, I can't do that, you can explain what is impossible, but you can also say, you know what, I will try to do it. And then you can go there and try at least show why it doesn't work. So in a way, you waste your time, but you don't really waste your time because you educate these people. You demonstrate that, look, I am trying to do what you say. I'm showing you why it's not working, so I'm educating you. That demonstrates goodwill. Second thing is exactly that, showing rather than explaining. It's very difficult for people to imagine an interface through words. Even if you're a designer, it's difficult to imagine things that way. If you're not a designer, it's even more difficult. That's why take the time to show, not just to explain. It feels like it is wasted time because you already know the answer, but demonstrating the answer to the others is a worthwhile thing. Like, think of all the people in, I don't know, the university you went through who made an effort to explain things to you, to show you the things that they knew. They could have just said, why don't you understand it in 2 minutes? They don't say you're stupid. They say, no, I will make the effort to show it to you. I care about you and I will make this effort. And the third thing is putting things in context. So rather than saying that doesn't work for whatever reason, is explain the context. Look, we have things that depend here upon each other. If you do this, there's going to be these consequences. I'm showing you what they could be. Now you understand. I think if you do that for a while, stakeholders will warm up and they will be educated no matter how skeptic they are. Because skeptics are my best friends. I think it's cruel to try to convince a skeptic of anything, because if you really have the truth, all you have to do is show it, and the skeptic will be the first to accept it. You only have to convince someone who's, closed-minded believer, but not a skeptic. The skeptic will always be open, but you have to show it to them. Once they see it, they recognize it. It's a lot of effort to show it sometimes, but it's worth doing it.
I really believe your words are so true because when you were explaining what you just mentioned, I just thought about one thing that happened in my career. We were not having a huge, let's say, understanding of UX UI in the company. And we started to have a UX designer, but people did not really listen to him. I even remember some stakeholder or manager saying that it's just a cost, it's useless. And one day, what we did was just to show what the potential of UX if we revamp the user interface. And for that, I just asked the UX designer to replicate a prototype of the current user interface. And I also asked him to do the new one that we have in mind to improve the software. And you know what? We just went to a management meeting and we asked them to go through to show actually what's the difference. On top of that, we also showed that to some customers. So we had also quite some nice customer feedback. And that was crazy. We blow up the audience. They were like, when do we have the new interface? When can you make it happen? Because they were going through it by themselves. They saw, like, I don't know, you reduce by 50% the number of clicks. You stop talking about features because you really see that having less features that nobody uses was making the user interface much more lean, clean. You always know where to go. And that's how it started for me, how to grow the influence of the UX UI team in my organization. But that was one of the biggest learning I got. Showing is much more powerful than anything else.
Yes.
So great. I mean, it's already been sometimes we are discussing. There is one very important thing that I would like to ask you. We love framework in product management. I'm not a huge fan of them in general, but we have so many delivery framework. And I wanted to ask you something. Do you know or do you use some framework for discovery? I feel this is still the part where product manager and also healthcare organization needs to learn a lot. How to do a good discovery. Do you have a process?
Yes. But let me say this, frameworks have no intrinsic worth, absolutely none. And if you're sort of in a position where you're saying, I'm absolutely clueless about what framework to choose, I would say choose at random. It's always better to, have something that gives you structure. But it's impossible to say there is one structure that everybody should have. That's why I say frameworks have no intrinsic worth in them. So you have to always adapt what you do to the task that you're doing. But at the same time, structure is important. So I'm not saying don't use a framework. I think for me, that is an easy position because having done, I don't know, hundreds of projects and of discoveries, for me, it's very intuitive to say, oh, with this one, we'll use that framework and we'll change it in that way. Because I think that's a thing that comes with experience. At the same time, I would say if you have absolutely no understanding of what you're doing and of frameworks, then you might just as well pick at random. But I think that when it comes to discovery, the key thing is to do it piecemeal, to try to create a structure, not for the whole thing. Because the thing with discovery is that you cannot anticipate. And it's only valuable if you find things that you cannot anticipate. If you find only the things that you already know or that are close to what you know, then it's been almost a waste of time. So that's what I would say. Think of the things that you have absolutely no idea about. Try to develop a tiny structure for the very first few steps. For example, you might say, okay, we'll use this recipe. We come up with questions, all of us that we have. We put them together in a bucket. Then we try to create a hierarchy of them. We'll pick the top 5. And then we'll try to create for any of those 5 questions that we have, we'll derive 5 other questions that are more applied. So now we suddenly have 25 questions. We'll just do 10 interviews with those 10 questions, whatever, how many we have, and we'll see what happens. That is already a little bit of a structure. The thing is, after you've done that, hopefully your perspective will have changed so much that you would say, oh, now I see the next step because now I've become curious about these things. And so this is where the structure is only for a little bit. It's not for the whole thing. I already know what's coming because I've done it many times and I see all the forks in the road and where we could go. If you've never done it before, it doesn't really matter that much. Just do the first step, but try to make the first step have some structure. So, for example, the opposite of what I said, going into the first step with absolutely no structure is scheduling the interviews and just starting a conversation with things that come into your mind at that point in time. Well, that's a little bit too little structure, I think.
Good. I like it. Principle even better than framework, and there's some guiding principle, a bit of structure, and then try to see what we learn from the first step. Great learning. Thank you very much, Dennis. And last thing, how do you see evolving UX UI in the next 10 years?
I wish I knew, would be my very first reaction. And I say that in the most optimistic manner. I hope that the things that will happen in the next 10 years are things that I cannot anticipate. I think what we will see is that we will deal a lot more. Well, no, let me put it 2 scenarios, right? One is we will deal a lot more with the things that we should be dealing with, this element of actually delivering the value in a way that it matters to the users and so on, everything that we've been talking about. That's where I see a lot of tools being developed. We had a lot of tools. There's so much growth of tools in this space, even before AI. Now everybody's trying to bring AI into that. Everybody's probably waiting for Figma to come up with an AI that's where you push a button and then everything is solved and so on. There's one world where that will help us free up a lot of time, focus on the important stuff, the things that only people can do, which is understand other people and so on. There is the other world where it becomes very cheap. And this pull that people have towards, let's do the cheap thing. Let's just cross our to-dos. Let's just push the button and then let's go to market with whatever the AI gives us. And then we'll do the same with the marketing. We'll do the same with everything. And then even the patients don't show up anymore. They just send their AI. Everything will be thousands of AIs, right? This is another extreme that I can imagine. I think the reality will be that it will be a mixture of the two. And I think because of that, there are big chances that actually things will become a lot better, while at the same time becoming a lot worse. So the question then becomes, what do you focus on in these coming years as a designer? I think the worst thing you could do is lose the focus, let yourself become distracted, or trying to force some kind of control that you don't have. I think instead of thinking, what do I need to have or what do I need to do in order to produce some impactful change that's valuable and so on, I would say let go of that. That's not the question. The question is, what do I need to give up in order to participate in a constructive way? If you let that happen, as scary as it is, I think you will inevitably come up with meaningful impact. And I think that if people do more of that, in 10 years, we'll have things that I cannot anticipate. So neither of the two extremes I have described, and I hope it's going to be the case. But sometimes the most disappointing thing is when your predictions actually turn out to be true.
Let's see. Let's have again this podcast in 10 years and let's see how true you are and if you made good prediction. Thank you
Yeah.
very much, Dennis.
We
Where
will
can
both
we
be
find you?
baristas. I think if you head to creativenavy.com, that will be fun because we don't have a lot of stuff on our website, but the stuff that we have, we actually did put a lot of effort and soul into things like case studies, or we also have a link to our blog where we publish very niche thinking or research that we do. There's a lot of effort that goes into that. I've also published a book last year about the design of medical interfaces in this industry. That's just, if you just Google my name, it should come up. It's on Amazon. If you have the time to read that, have fun. But I think the website is the place to stay current, really.
Then thank you very much, Dennis. That's the end of our episode today. It was a product planning podcast. If you have any interest for some topics, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Also, please bring us some feedback. We are very happy to listen to you and we are looking forward to have you in another episode. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks, Theo. It's been great being here.